Have you ever witnessed someone with power abuse it, thinking they're untouchable? Imagine that moment when their world crumbles before their eyes. What if a single act of arrogance led to the complete destruction of everything they built? Today's story isn't just about karma. It's about what happens when the tables turn so dramatically that even justice feels like poetry. In this video, you'll witness Officer James Wilson's shocking fall from power after assaulting a woman in court, only to discover she's his new boss. We'll take you through every moment of this riveting story, from the courtroom confrontation to his prison sentence and the systemic changes that followed. This isn't just entertainment. It's a powerful examination of accountability, justice, and the responsibility that comes with authority. If this is your first time here at Truth Revealed, we bring stories that expose injustice and celebrate accountability. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell right now so you never miss our weekly explorations of power dynamics and justice served. Our community values thoughtful discussion over quick judgments. Join us. Now let's dive into today's incredible story. The courtroom was packed to capacity, a sea of tense faces beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. The air felt heavy, charged with an electric anticipation that made it difficult to breathe. Every creak of the wooden benches, every whispered comment seemed amplified in the cavernous room. Outside, rain lashed against the tall windows, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the drama unfolding within these walls. At the center of it all stood two figures locked in silent combat. On one side, Officer James Wilson, tall, imposing, his blue uniform crisp and authoritative, his badge gleaming under the lights. His jaw was set in that familiar expression of absolute certainty that had served him well for 15 years on the force. Across from him stood Olivia Bennett, composed, unflinching, her dark eyes reflecting not fear, but something far more dangerous, defiance. The tension between them was palpable, stretching across the room like a taut wire. This wasn't just another case, another day in court. This was a collision of worlds, a moment where power and justice would clash in ways that would leave everyone forever changed. No one in the room could have predicted how this confrontation would end, least of all Officer Wilson himself. Before we dive into today's story, I want to take a moment to speak directly to you, our viewers. Here at Truth Revealed, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in all forms. The stories we share aren't just entertainment, they're reflections of real struggles happening every day in America. We believe in a world where power comes with accountability, where a badge doesn't place anyone above the law, and where justice applies equally to all. These aren't just ideals, they're fundamental rights that too many are still fighting to secure. If you've ever faced prejudice or been made to feel powerless by those who should protect you, know that your experiences matter. Your voice matters. This channel is dedicated to amplifying stories that expose truth and deliver justice where it's due. If you value these stories as much as we do, please support our mission by subscribing to our channel and hitting that like button. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these powerful narratives to light. The city of Westlake rises from the coastline like a testament to human ambition, gleaming skyscrapers reaching toward the clouds, historic buildings standing as reminders of a different era. But beneath this impressive facade lies a complex web of power, influence, and unwritten rules. In Westlake, who you know often matters more than what you've done. The justice system operates like a well-oiled machine, but one that doesn't always serve everyone equally. Courtrooms become theaters where the privileged often walk free while others find themselves crushed under the full weight of the law. The police department has long been the backbone of this system, officers like James Wilson building careers on maintaining the status quo, on protecting certain parts of the city while controlling others. For decades, this delicate balance has held firm, with those at the top rarely questioned and those at the bottom rarely heard. But something has been shifting in Westlake. New voices are rising, challenging old structures. Accountability is becoming more than just a word politicians throw around during election seasons. The foundations that men like Wilson have built their careers upon have begun to tremble. And now, in that packed courtroom, as thunder rolls outside and tension builds within, these two worlds are about to collide. Authority and accountability stand face to face, neither willing to back down. What happens next won't just change individual lives, it will shake the very system that Westlake was built upon. Introducing Officer James Wilson. Officer James Wilson cast a long shadow wherever he went. 6'3", with broad shoulders and the solid build of someone who still maintained the same fitness regimen he'd followed since his military days. His uniform was always impeccable, creases sharp enough to cut paper, brass buttons polished to a mirror shine, and a badge that he kept gleaming as if it were made of gold instead of standard issue metal. But it was his eyes that people remembered most, ice blue, penetrating, with a coldness that could freeze you mid-sentence. Those eyes had seen 15 years of Westlake's darkest corners, and they carried none of the compassion or weariness you might expect. Instead, they held something harder, a certainty, an unwavering belief in his own authority. Wilson had joined the force after a brief stint in the Marines, rising quickly through the ranks on a combination of impressive arrest records, political savvy, and an uncanny ability to align himself with the right people at the right time. His personnel file contained 12 commendations, 17 excessive force complaints, all dismissed, and a reputation that preceded him in every neighborhood in Westlake. If Wilson's in your corner, you're untouchable, the saying went around the precinct. If you're on his bad side, God help you. The world, according to James Wilson, was refreshingly simple. There were those who maintained order, people like him, the thin blue line, and there were those who created chaos. There were neighborhoods worth protecting and neighborhoods worth controlling. There were citizens and there were suspects. The line between them wasn't determined by actions or evidence, but by things far more fundamental in Wilson's mind: by appearance, by address, by whether someone showed proper respect when he approached. Some people understand only one language, he often told rookies under his supervision: authority. Everything else is just noise. What made Wilson truly dangerous wasn't just his prejudices, it was his absolute conviction that his worldview wasn't prejudiced at all, but simply the natural order of things. He didn't see himself as above the law. In his mind, he was the law. Wilson's daily routine. The black and white patrol car cruised slowly down Riverfront Avenue, a predator surveying its territory. Inside, Wilson drove with one hand casually draped over the wheel, his posture relaxed yet alert, eyes constantly scanning the streets from behind mirrored sunglasses. Beside him sat Officer Ryan Thomas, 26 years old with only 18 months on the force. Thomas was scrolling through the day's bulletins on the car's computer, occasionally glancing up at the passing storefronts. "Looks like we've got court at 11, Thomas said, swiping through notifications. The Bennett case. Wilson made a dismissive sound at the back of his throat. Another waste of taxpayer money. You know how these cases go. Some bleeding heart lawyer crying about civil rights while their client has a rap sheet longer than my arm. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Actually, I looked into this one. The defendant has no priors. College student, Dean's List, no record at all until our arrest. No record we know about, Wilson corrected, turning down a side street that cut through the predominantly black neighborhood of East Heights. He slowed the car as they passed a group of young men standing outside a corner store. See that? Middle of a Tuesday, and they're just hanging around. No jobs, no purpose. Could be college students on break, Thomas suggested quietly. East Heights Community College is just down the block. Wilson shot him a sideways glance. You've been spending too much time with those sensitivity trainers, Thomas. Next, you'll be telling me we need to get their permission before making an arrest. Thomas fell silent, turning back to the computer. This was becoming a familiar pattern, these moments where Wilson would say something that made Thomas's stomach knot up, followed by his own cowardly silence. He'd joined the force to make a difference, to protect people. Lately, he'd been wondering exactly who he was protecting. Look, you're not a bad cop, Wilson continued, his tone softening slightly. You've got good instincts. But this job isn't about making friends. It's about maintaining order. Sometimes that means making tough calls that people don't like. Remember that. Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As they continued their patrol, he found himself wondering when tough calls had become a euphemism for something much darker. The courthouse arrival. The Westlake County Courthouse stood like a Roman temple in the heart of downtown, imposing white columns, broad marble steps, and the words, "Equal justice under law," carved into the stone above massive wooden doors. Wilson had always appreciated the irony of that inscription. Justice wasn't equal. It never had been. It was a performance, a carefully choreographed dance where everyone played their parts, but the ending was usually predetermined. Wilson climbed the steps with the confidence of a man entering his own living room rather than a hall of justice. He'd been in this building hundreds of times, had testified in every courtroom, knew every security guard and clerk by name. This was his stage as much as the streets were. "Remember, let me do the talking," he instructed Thomas as they passed through security, without being won a professional courtesy extended to officers in uniform. "These hearings are all about presentation. Judge Carlton has a full docket today. He wants this wrapped up quickly." As they pushed through the double doors of Courtroom 3, Wilson scanned a room with the practiced eye of someone assessing for threats. The usual players were all there, the overworked public defenders huddled with their clients, the prosecutor organizing files at her table, court officers standing at attention. And then he saw her. She stood by the defense table, her back to him, engaged in conversation with her client. Even from behind, something about her commanded attention. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun that emphasized the elegant line of her neck. When she turned slightly, Wilson caught her profile's strong cheekbones, determined jaw, skin the color of burnished copper. Olivia Bennett. He'd heard the name around the precinct, read it in case files, seen it mentioned in newspaper articles about police oversight committees. But he'd never faced her in court. Something about her bearing the way she stood, the intensity with which she listened to her client triggered an immediate dislike in Wilson. She carried herself with a confidence that bordered on defiance. Thomas leaned closer. That's Bennett. She doesn't look like a pushover. Wilson's mouth tightened. Doesn't matter what she looks like. She's just another defense attorney who thinks she can change the system. They all learn eventually. The confrontation begins. When Olivia Bennett turned fully toward the prosecution table, her eyes swept across the room and landed directly on Wilson. There was no fear in that gaze, no deference, not even the professional wariness that most defense attorneys showed toward the officers testifying against their clients. Instead, there was something that Wilson recognized instantly as a challenge, a silent statement that she saw him exactly for what he was. His dislike hardened into something colder, more visceral. Wilson had encountered many black professionals in his career, prosecutors, judges, fellow officers, and he maintained a certain level of grudging respect for those who had earned their place according to his worldview. But something about this woman's unwavering stare triggered every prejudice he harbored. "Who does she think she's looking at?" he muttered to Thomas. Before his partner could respond, Bennett excused herself from her client and walked directly toward them. Up close, Wilson could see the intelligence in her dark eyes, the slight lift of her chin that spoke volumes about her refusal to be intimidated. "Officer Wilson," she said, her voice smooth and controlled. "I was hoping to speak with you before we begin. There are some inconsistencies in your arrest report that I'd like to clarify." Wilson felt heat rise up his neck. Inconsistencies. The word hung in the air between them like an accusation. "My report stands as written, Counselor," he replied, emphasizing the title slightly, making it sound less like a professional designation and more like an insult. "Maybe you should spend more time advising your client to tell the truth and less time looking for loopholes." Bennett's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, not hurt or surprise, but something closer to confirmation. As if he had just proven a point she had already suspected. "This isn't about loopholes, officer. This is about the facts. Your body camera was conveniently turned off during the critical moments of the arrest. The witness statements contradict your version of events. And the search that produced the alleged evidence occurred before you established probable cause." Wilson stepped closer, using his height to tower over her, his voice dropping to a level that wouldn't carry to the other side of a courtroom. "Let me make something clear, Ms. Bennett. I've been doing this job since you were probably still in law school. I don't make mistakes on arrests, and I don't appreciate my integrity being questioned by defense attorneys trying to make names for themselves." The tension between them was almost palpable now, drawing glances from around the courtroom. But Bennett didn't back down. She didn't even blink. "This isn't about your experience, Officer Wilson," she replied, her voice equally low but razor-sharp. "It's about your conduct. And unlike some others you've encountered, I'm not intimidated by your badge or your reputation." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty, the lack of any deference, made Wilson's control slip. Before he could check himself, words escaped his mouth that would set in motion everything that followed. "You people always think you know better, don't you?" The verbal confrontation. The courtroom fell silent as Wilson's words hung in the air between them. "You people always think you know better, don't you?" His voice carried just enough for those nearby to hear, the contempt in his tone unmistakable. Olivia Bennett's expression didn't change, but something hardened in her eyes, a recognition of what those two words, "you people," truly meant. She had heard them before, knew exactly the weight they carried, the history behind them. But unlike many who had faced Wilson's intimidation tactics, she didn't look away. "By you people," she replied, her voice measured and clear. "I assume you mean attorneys who expect officers to follow the law they're sworn to uphold." Wilson stepped closer, using his physical presence as a weapon. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You know exactly what I mean. I've seen your type before coming into my city, stirring up trouble, making everything about race when it's about law and order. Your city." Olivia raised an eyebrow, standing her ground despite Wilson towering over her. "Interesting choice of words, Officer Wilson. Last I checked, Westlake belongs to all its citizens, including those your department seems to target disproportionately." By now, the private confrontation had become public. The prosecutor had looked up from her files, frowning. Several jurors who had entered early were watching with undisguised interest. Thomas had taken a step back, his discomfort visible. "You think you're so damn smart with your fancy law degree," Wilson continued, his voice rising. "But out there in the real world, people like me are the ones keeping this city from falling apart while people like you sit in comfortable offices criticizing every move we make." The court officer shifted nervously, clearly uncertain whether to intervene in an argument involving a police officer. The judge hadn't entered yet, but the tension in the room was becoming palpable. Olivia's response came with quiet dignity that somehow diminished Wilson's bluster. "Officer Wilson, my concern isn't with your job, it's with how you're doing it. The Constitution doesn't have exceptions for your convenience, and neither does justice." A few murmurs of approval rippled through the courtroom. Wilson noticed heads nodding, eyes watching him with judgment rather than the respect he was accustomed to. Something dangerous flashed across his face, the look of a man unaccustomed to being challenged, especially publicly. "You have no idea what justice is," he snarled, loud enough now that everyone could hear. "Justice is keeping dangerous people off the streets, not finding technicalities to put them back on them. But what would you know about keeping communities safe?" The prosecutor finally stood. "Officer Wilson, perhaps we should discuss the case details in private before." "No!" Wilson cut her off without even looking in her direction. "I want to hear what Ms. Bennett thinks gives her the right to question my methods when she's never walked a beat, never faced danger, never had to make split-second decisions that could mean life or death." The atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed completely from the routine morning proceedings to a charged confrontation that revealed far more than a disagreement about case details. It exposed the fault lines running through Westlake's justice system itself. The physical assault. What happened next occurred so quickly that many witnesses would later have trouble describing the exact sequence of events. Wilson's face had flushed dark red, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple. As Olivia began to respond, her voice still remarkably composed, he made a sudden movement, not a punch, which might have been easier to categorize as assault, but something more calculating. His right boot connected with her shin in a swift, brutal kick that was simultaneously an attack and a statement, an action designed to humiliate as much as to hurt. The impact was audible, a dull thud that seemed to echo in the suddenly silent courtroom. "Officer Wilson." Thomas gasped, stepping forward too late. Olivia stumbled slightly, but caught herself against the edge of the defense table. For a fraction of a second, pain flashed across her face, raw and genuine, before being replaced by something else, a steely resolve mixed with something almost like certainty, as if a theory had just been proven correct. The courtroom erupted. The judge had just entered through the side door and witnessed the tail end of the assault. His gavel slammed down repeatedly. "Order!" What in God's name is happening in my courtroom? Several people had risen to their feet. Olivia's client looked terrified. The prosecutor stood frozen, files clutched against her chest, her expression one of pure disbelief. Court officers moved forward uncertainly. Their training hadn't prepared them for a police officer assaulting an attorney in open court. He kicked her. Everyone saw it, someone called from the gallery. What was most remarkable, what would be discussed in whispers throughout the Westlake legal community for months afterward, was Olivia Bennett's response. Despite what must have been significant pain, she straightened herself, adjusted her jacket with steady hands, and looked Wilson directly in the eyes. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She didn't even acknowledge the physical blow. Instead, she maintained a dignified silence that somehow spoke volumes more than any reaction could have. It was the response of someone who refused to be reduced to a victim, who understood that her power lay in rising above his attempt to diminish her. Wilson's aftermath reaction. The most chilling aspect of the next moments wasn't Wilson's violence, it was his complete lack of remorse. As the courtroom chaos swirled around them, his expression shifted from rage to something resembling satisfaction, then to a smug certainty that nothing of consequence would happen to him. He adjusted his belt casually, straightening his uniform, as though he'd done nothing more significant than swat at a fly. The corner of his mouth lifted in a half-smile as he glanced at the stunned faces around him. "If you can't handle a little confrontation," he announced loudly, addressing Olivia, but projecting his voice to the entire room, "maybe you should reconsider whether you belong in a courtroom." Thomas had backed away from his partner, his face ashen. "Wilson, what the hell?" he began, but Wilson cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Relax. It's not like I shot her." He chuckled at his own joke, looking around for support that wasn't forthcoming. These people always overreact. Make everything into a federal case. There was again, these people, the mask slipping further to reveal the prejudice beneath. Wilson seemed oblivious to how he was digging himself deeper with every word, with every moment of his continued arrogance. "Officer Wilson, you will approach the bench immediately." The judge's voice cut through the commotion, steel and fury in equal measure. Wilson rolled his eyes slightly, a gesture so subtle that only those closest to him caught it, the ultimate expression of his belief that even the judge's authority was something he could dismiss if he chose. But something was happening in the courtroom that Wilson hadn't yet registered. The atmosphere had shifted. The shock was giving way to something else, a collective realization, a turning of the tide. Court officers who had hesitated before were now moving toward him with purpose. The prosecutor had stepped away from him, distancing herself both physically and symbolically. For the first time, the faintest flicker of uncertainty crossed Wilson's face. Not regret for his actions, but the dawning awareness that the script wasn't playing out as expected. The shield of impunity that had protected him throughout his career suddenly seemed thinner than before. The entrance of authority. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with deliberate force. The sound cut through the chaos like a thunderclap, drawing every eye in the room. Through the doorway marched a line of uniformed officers, not regular patrol cops, but high-ranking officials with the insignia and bearing of command staff. Their faces were grim, purposeful, their synchronized movements suggesting this was no coincidental arrival. At their head walked Commissioner Richard Hayes, the silver-haired, broad-shouldered leader of the Westlake Police Department. Hayes rarely appeared in courtrooms. His presence alone was enough to silence the room instantly. He surveyed the scene with the measured assessment of someone who had handled crises for decades. Behind Hayes stood Captain Martinez and 3 senior lieutenants, the upper echelon of departmental authority. Their expressions gave nothing away, but their presence spoke volumes. This wasn't a random visit. They had come for a purpose. "What's going on?" Thomas whispered, but Wilson didn't answer. For the first time that day, perhaps for the first time in years, James Wilson felt something unfamiliar creeping up his spine, genuine uncertainty. Commissioner Hayes' eyes locked with Wilson's across the courtroom. There was something in that gaze, not just disappointment or anger, but a grim finality that made Wilson's stomach tighten. Hayes had been his protector more than once during internal affairs investigations, had praised his old-school approach to policing in private meetings. But the look on his face now held no hint of that previous support. "Officer Wilson." Hayes' voice carried easily through the silent courtroom. "Stand down. Now." The command was simple but delivered with an authority that expected immediate compliance. Wilson's body responded automatically to the tone, shoulders straightening, chin lifting before his mind caught up to the situation. "Commissioner, I was just—" "Silence." Hayes cut him off with a single word. The public rebuke from his highest superior sent a ripple of whispers through the courtroom. Wilson fell silent, a vein pulsing in his temple. His eyes darted around the room, registering the changed expressions on faces that had always shown deference before. Court officers who used to greet him warmly now watched him with wary suspicion. The prosecutor who had relied on his testimony dozens of times now wouldn't meet his eyes. Something was very wrong. Wilson felt it in his gut, a growing dread, a sense that events were spiraling beyond his control. He looked toward Olivia Bennett, half expecting to see triumph in her eyes, but what he saw instead was far more unsettling, calm certainty, as if this moment had been inevitable all along. Hayes stepped forward, his next words measured carefully for maximum impact in the silent courtroom. Whatever was about to happen, it was clear that it had been planned, that mechanisms had been set in motion long before Wilson's boot had connected with Olivia's shin. The tension in the room built to an unbearable peak as Hayes glanced between Wilson and Bennett, the seconds stretching like hours, the weight of 15 years of unchecked authority hanging in the balance. The twist revealed. "Officer James Wilson," Commissioner Hayes began, his voice carrying the weight of formal declaration, "I'd like to introduce you to Captain Olivia Bennett, newly appointed head of Internal Affairs and Ethics Division." The words landed in the courtroom like a bomb detonation. Wilson's body went rigid, his face draining of color, so quickly it was as if someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, no words emerging. "Captain Bennett," Hayes continued, emphasizing her rank with deliberate clarity, "has been brought in from Chicago PD specifically to address ongoing concerns about departmental conduct and accountability." Her appointment was finalized last week, and today was to be her formal introduction to the courthouse staff. Wilson's mind raced desperately to process this information. Captain, Internal Affairs, his new superior. The woman he had just assaulted in front of dozens of witnesses was not only an attorney, but his direct boss in a division specifically tasked with investigating officers like him. "That's not possible," he finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I would have been informed." "The announcement memo went out this morning," Hayes cut in coldly. Perhaps if you'd checked your department email before coming to court, you would have been better prepared. The implication hung in the air that Wilson's behavior might have been different had he known who Bennett really was. That his respect was contingent not on basic human dignity, but on rank and power. The revelation exposed not just his actions, but the corrupt thinking behind them. Wilson's physical reaction was visible to everyone watching. His breathing became shallow and rapid. A slight tremor developed in his hands. Sweat beaded along his hairline, despite the courtroom's air conditioning. These were the signs of a man experiencing not just surprise, but existential panic, the sudden comprehension that his entire world had just imploded. His eyes darted wildly from Hayes to Bennett to the other officers, searching for any hint that this was some elaborate setup, some test he could still pass. Finding none, he looked back at Bennett with new eyes, seeing now not just a black woman he could intimidate, but a superior officer with the power to end his career. Bennett stepped forward, straightening the jacket Wilson had disheveled when he struck her. When she spoke, her voice was calm, professional, and pitched to carry to every corner of the hushed courtroom. "Officer Wilson, your conduct today has been documented and will be addressed through proper channels. I expect you to report to my office at 1,400 hours." A pause, heavy with meaning. "We have much to discuss about your record with the department." In that moment, the power dynamic that Wilson had taken for granted for 15 years reversed completely. The authority he had wielded like a weapon was stripped away, revealing the hollow core beneath his badge. And the woman he had tried to humiliate now held his fate in her hands. Immediate aftermath. The courtroom erupted into a buzz of whispered conversations. Journalists who had been present for what they thought would be a routine hearing were now frantically taking notes or slipping out to file breaking stories. Court officers exchanged meaningful glances. The judge, after a moment of stunned silence, regained his composure. "In light of these extraordinary circumstances," he announced, "this hearing will be continued until next week. Captain Bennett, please accept the court's apologies for what you've experienced today. Commissioner Hayes, I trust you'll be handling this matter internally as well." Hayes nodded grimly. "You can be assured of that, Your Honor." While this formal exchange proceeded at the bench, Wilson remained frozen in place, experiencing what could only be described as emotional whiplash. Just minutes ago, he had been the one in control, the one dishing out humiliation. Now he stood exposed, his transgression witnessed by the very people whose respect he had demanded for years. His mind raced through potential escapes, explanations, justifications, connections he could call upon. But the public nature of his misconduct, combined with Bennett's new position, closed off each avenue before it could fully form in his thoughts. Behind him, he could hear murmurs from the gallery. Did you see his face when he found out? 15 years of throwing his weight around, and now. Couldn't have happened to a more deserving guy. The undisguised satisfaction in these comments revealed another painful truth. Wilson had thought himself feared and respected, but for many in the Westlake justice system, today's comeuppance had been long awaited. Bennett conferred briefly with her client before gathering her materials with calm efficiency. She showed no triumph, no gloating, only the focused demeanor of a professional with a job to do. This restraint, this refusal to sink to Wilson's level, even when she clearly held the upper hand, somehow made the situation even more unbearable for him. As she passed by Wilson on her way out, she paused briefly. your service weapon and badge officer. You're on administrative leave, pending our meeting. Return to the station. The walk from the courthouse to the precinct had never felt so long. Wilson moved mechanically, each step heavy with the growing weight of consequences. Beside him, Commissioner Hayes and two lieutenants maintained a formal silence, creating an unmistakable escort of authority, not colleagues, but handlers. Officers and civilians alike stopped to stare as the group passed. News traveled fast in Westlake's justice system, and by the time Wilson reached the station steps, it seemed everyone knew what had happened in Courtroom 3. The precinct that had been Wilson's kingdom for 15 years transformed before his eyes. The front desk sergeant, who had always greeted him with friendly banter, now gave only a curt nod, eyes carefully averted. Conversations stopped as he passed. Junior officers who normally scrambled to impress him suddenly found paperwork that needed their immediate attention. In the squad room, the change was even more palpable. His fellow officers, men and women who had followed his lead, laughed at his jokes, accepted his methods without question, now viewed him through new eyes. Some showed open disapproval, others simple disbelief. But most painful were those who exhibited something Wilson had never before experienced from colleagues: pity. "Man, you really stepped in at this time," muttered Gonzalez, a veteran officer who had been Wilson's poker buddy for a decade. "A captain? From Internal Affairs? What were you thinking?" Wilson had no answer. The truth that he would never have treated Bennett that way had he known her rank was too damning to admit aloud. As he moved toward his desk, he caught snippets of whispered conversations. "Did you hear? He kicked her. Actually kicked her right in the courtroom. Bennett's going to tear this place apart, starting with him. How long do you think before they find everything he's been hiding?" That last comment sent a chill through Wilson, because there was plenty hidden, reports sanitized, evidence mishandled, corners cut, suspects treated in ways that would never withstand proper scrutiny. For 15 years, the system had protected him, had deemed his results worth the occasional overlooked transgression. But as he reached his desk, the corner office that had symbolized his untouchable status, he found Captain Martinez waiting, his expression grim. "We need your gun and badge, Wilson. Now." The request was standard procedure for officers placed on administrative leave, but the public nature of it, in full view of the entire squad room, was deliberate. This wasn't just administrative. It was symbolic. With shaking hands that he couldn't control, Wilson unholstered his service weapon and unpinned his badge. The weight of them leaving his possession felt like physical pain, the stripping away of an identity he had worn for so long he'd forgotten where the badge ended and he began. As he surrendered the symbols of his authority, the whispers around him grew louder, more confident. The fear that had kept his colleagues in line was evaporating, replaced by something far more dangerous to a man like Wilson: the truth. His kingdom hadn't just been challenged. It had crumbled completely. And as he looked up to see Olivia Bennett watching from the doorway of what would now be her office, Wilson realized that this wasn't just the end of a career. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Meeting with Olivia. The clock on the wall of Captain Bennett's office ticked loudly in the silence. 2 p.m. exactly. Wilson sat rigidly in the chair across from her desk, his body language a mixture of defiance and barely concealed anxiety. The office previously belonging to Captain Rodriguez before his sudden retirement had been transformed in just a few hours. Gone were the fishing trophies and faded photographs of poker nights. In their place stood neatly organized bookshelves filled with legal volumes and framed credentials that told the story of Bennett's meteoric rise through the ranks of Chicago PD. "I appreciate your punctuality, Officer Wilson," Bennett began, her voice neutral as she opened a thick file folder. She didn't look up immediately, allowing the tension to build as she reviewed the documents inside. Wilson shifted uncomfortably, the silence itself feeling like an interrogation technique. When she finally raised her eyes to meet his, the calm professionalism in her gaze was somehow more unnerving than anger would have been. "I've spent the morning reviewing your service record," she continued. 15 years. Numerous commendations. Impressive arrest statistics." She turned a page. "And 27 civilian complaints, none of which resulted in disciplinary action. 17 use-of-force incidents questioned by supervisors, all eventually dismissed. 6 officer-involved shootings, all deemed justified by internal review." "That's right," Wilson said, a hint of his old confidence returning. "Cleared every time. By your predecessors." Bennett nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, very thoroughly cleared." She selected a specific report, sliding it across the desk. "Like this one from 2018. A young man with no prior record claimed you planted evidence. The investigating officer was Lieutenant Parker, your former partner, wasn't he?" Wilson's jaw tightened. "The case was reviewed according to department procedure." "Indeed it was," Bennett agreed. "Just like all the others. Always following technical procedure while missing the broader pattern." She closed the folder decisively. "That pattern ends today, Officer Wilson." "With all due respect, Captain," Wilson leaned forward, struggling to keep his tone neutral, "I've served this department faithfully for 15 years. What happened in court was unfortunate, a misunderstanding, but my record speaks for itself." "Yes, it does," Bennett replied, her voice sharpening slightly. "Perhaps more clearly than you realize." She stood, signaling a shift in the conversation. "Your badge and gun have been surrendered. You're on administrative leave pending a full investigation into your conduct, not just today's assault, which occurred in front of dozens of witnesses, including the commissioner himself, but your entire history with this department." The reality of his situation began to sink in. This wasn't just about a momentary loss of control. Bennett wasn't interested in an apology or a reprimand. She was methodically dismantling the foundation of protection he'd relied on for years. "You can't do this," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You have no idea how things work in Westlake." Bennett's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, not intimidation, but something closer to confirmation of a hypothesis. "That," she said quietly, "is precisely why I'm here. The investigation. The investigation into Officer James Wilson's conduct moved with a speed and thoroughness unprecedented in Westlake Police Department history. Within days, Captain Bennett had assembled a team of officers from outside Wilson's circle of influence, supplemented by state investigators with specialized training in police misconduct cases. What began as an inquiry into the courthouse assault quickly expanded as Bennett's team uncovered a pattern that spanned Wilson's entire career. Cases were reopened. Evidence was re-examined. Witnesses who had previously been too frightened to speak found themselves invited to share their experiences with investigators who actually listened. For Wilson, watching from the sidelines during his administrative leave, the process felt like watching a building demolition in slow motion, the careful, methodical removal of each support beam until the entire structure became unstable. They're interviewing Torres about the Miller arrest, his sole remaining ally on the force told him during a furtive phone call. They've got the body cam footage that went missing. And Bennett's team found the original witness statements, the ones that never made it into the final report. Wilson's stomach tightened with each new revelation. Cases he'd considered long buried were being exhumed, examined under the harsh light of actual scrutiny rather than the perfunctory reviews of the past. Evidence he'd assumed destroyed was somehow reappearing. Colleagues who had once covered for him were now saving themselves by telling the truth. At the precinct, his name transformed from one spoken with respect to one whispered with caution. Officers who had once emulated his methods now distanced themselves, scrubbing their own records clean of any connection to his cases. The thin blue line, which Wilson had believed unbreakable, proved remarkably flexible when careers were at stake. Most painful was the complete reversal in Officer Ryan Thomas's attitude. Wilson spotted him one morning, entering the station as Wilson sat in his car across the street, reduced to watching his former domain from the outside. Thomas was walking alongside Captain Bennett, engaged. In animated conversation, his expression earnest and determined as he gestured with his hands. Later that week, Wilson learned that Thomas had been promoted to a special task force focused on community relations and transparency. Bennett's new initiative to rebuild trust in neighborhoods that had suffered most under Wilson's aggressive tactics. "You trained me to be like you," Thomas told him during their one brief, uncomfortable encounter at a local diner. "I wanted to be just like you. But you know what I realized, Wilson? You weren't training me to be a good cop. You were training me to protect bad ones." Wilson had no response. The betrayal burned, not just because Thomas had turned against him, but because some small, honest part of Wilson recognized the truth in his words. As the investigation deepened, Wilson began to understand that this wasn't just about ending his career. Bennett was systematically exposing every crack in the foundation of the system that had protected officers like him. Each revelation seemed strategically timed to support policy changes, each disclosure of misconduct followed by a departmental reform announcement. This wasn't personal vengeance for the courtroom assault. This was something far more comprehensive. This was structural change, using Wilson as both example and justification. And he had handed her the perfect catalyst with that single, impulsive kick. The indictment. The grand jury took just 3 days to return an indictment, a process that typically stretched for weeks when police officers were involved. Wilson received the news via a formal letter, followed by a phone call from the department's legal counsel advising him to surrender himself the following morning. The charges were extensive: assault, official misconduct, evidence tampering, multiple civil rights violations, and witness intimidation. Each count meticulously documented, each charge supported by evidence that Bennett's investigation had uncovered with surgical precision. But it was the press conference announcing the indictment that truly demonstrated how completely Wilson's world had shifted. Standing before a forest of microphones, Captain Bennett addressed the city with the calm authority of someone fulfilling a long-planned mission. Today's indictment represents not just accountability for one officer's actions, but a turning point for our department, she stated, flanked by Commissioner Hayes and the district attorney. The investigation revealed systemic failures that allowed misconduct to go unchecked for years. While Officer Wilson must answer for his individual actions, we as a department must answer for creating an environment where such behavior could flourish. Wilson watched the broadcast from his apartment, a tumbler of whiskey trembling in his hand. The language was careful, the delivery measured, but the message was unmistakable. He wasn't just being sacrificed, he was being used as the face of everything wrong with Westlake policing. His lawyer, not the department's counsel who had protected him for years, but a private attorney taking his case only after several others refused, was blunt about his prospects. "The evidence is overwhelming," she told him. "Witnesses are coming forward daily. Officers who worked with you are cutting deals to save themselves by testifying against you. And the courthouse assault happened in front of a room full of legal professionals. We need to discuss plea options." Wilson slammed his fist on the table. "No deals. They're making an example of me for doing exactly what the department wanted all these years. Hayes, Rodriguez, they all praised my methods when crime stats were down. Now they're pretending they never knew." The attorney's expression remained impassive. "That may well be true. It doesn't change the evidence against you." The next morning, Wilson demanded a meeting with Bennett. To his surprise, she agreed to see him in her office, though with another officer present as witness. "You've got what you wanted," Wilson said as soon as the door closed behind him. "You've destroyed my career, turned the department against me, made me into some kind of monster. Happy now?" Bennett studied him for a long moment before responding. "This isn't about happiness, Officer Wilson. It's about accountability, something you've managed to avoid your entire career." She leaned forward slightly. "But you're mistaken about one thing. I didn't destroy your career. You did that yourself, one abuse of power at a time." Wilson's hands curled into fists at his sides. "So what happens now? You parade me through the system like some trophy? Make sure everyone sees the great Captain Bennett taking down the bad cop." "What happens now," Bennett replied evenly, "is that for the first time in your career, you face the same justice system you claim to serve. Without your badge to protect you. Without colleagues to cover for you. Just like every civilian you've arrested over the years." A pause. "The only difference is you actually did what you're accused of." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. For the first time, Wilson felt something beyond anger and resentment, the first cold touch of genuine fear. Loss of badge and gun. Though Wilson had already surrendered his badge and service weapon on the day of the courthouse incident, the formal ceremony of discharge carried a weight all its own. Department policy required a final meeting, a signing of documents, an official acknowledgement of separation from service. For most officers, retirement or resignation meant a gathering of colleagues, perhaps drinks afterward, handshakes and reminiscences about cases solved and lives saved. For Wilson, it meant a sterile conference room with only the HR director, a department lawyer, and a stone-faced Captain Bennett present to witness his professional execution. The badge and gun had already been logged into evidence, so the ceremony centered on paperwork forms officially terminating his employment, documents acknowledging his understanding of the charges against him, releases signing away pension rights in the event of conviction. With each signature, Wilson felt another piece of his identity stripped away. The pen shook slightly in his hand, betraying an emotion he refused to name. 15 years reduced to initials on termination papers. A career ended not with commendations, but with criminal charges. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, his voice hoarse, as Bennett slid the final document toward him, a formal acknowledgement that he was now prohibited from entering any Westlake Police Department facility without prior authorization. "Every step of this process follows department procedure," Bennett replied, the irony of her words not lost on either of them. Wilson had hidden behind procedure for years. Now, those same rigid rules were being applied to him without flexibility or exception. When the last form was signed, Wilson stood, straightening his shoulders out of habit, reaching instinctively for a weapon that was no longer at his hip. The phantom weight of the missing badge seemed to burn against his chest. So that's it. 15 years just erased. Bennett gathered the documents methodically, her movements unhurried. "Not erased, Officer Wilson. Accounted for. There's a difference." He walked out of the station for the final time, passing through the same doors he'd entered thousands of times before, but now as a civilian, worse, as a criminal defendant awaiting trial. Officers he'd worked with for years averted their eyes. The desk sergeant, who had always greeted him with friendly banter, now watched him with wary caution, hand resting near his own weapon, as if Wilson might suddenly become dangerous. Outside, the bright afternoon sunlight felt harsh, exposing. Without the armor of his uniform, without the shield of his badge, Wilson felt naked, vulnerable in a way he'd never experienced. The city he had claimed to protect now seemed alien territory, a place where he no longer belonged. As he reached the bottom of the station steps, Bennett's voice called after him. "Wilson." He turned, squinting against the sun, to see her standing in the doorway, backlit and authoritative. "The system you helped build," she said, her voice carrying easily across the distance between them, "is the same one you'll now face as a defendant. Remember that." It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder that the machine of justice he had operated so carelessly for others would now process him with the same indifference. The trial and verdict. The state of Illinois versus James Wilson began 6 months after the courthouse assault. The trial that Wilson's attorneys had fought to delay moved forward with unprecedented speed, propelled by public interest and political pressure for resolution. The courtroom was different from one where Wilson had assaulted Bennett, larger, more formal, filled daily with journalists, activists, and citizens drawn to what newspapers were calling the case that exposed Westlake's broken blue line. Judge Harrison Mercer, known for his strict courtroom management and impeccable fairness, presided with a gravity that matched the proceedings' significance. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically, building not just on the courthouse assault that everyone had witnessed, but on the pattern of misconduct that Bennett's investigation had uncovered. Former arrestees testified about evidence that appeared mysteriously at crime scenes. Fellow officers, granted immunity, described report tampering and witness intimidation tactics. Forensic experts analyzed body cam footage that had been edited before submission to previous investigations. Most damaging was the testimony of Ryan Thomas, who described in painfully specific detail how Wilson had trained him to operate outside department guidelines while maintaining the appearance of procedural correctness. "He told me there were 2 sets of rules," Thomas testified, unable to meet Wilson's eyes across the courtroom. "The ones in the manual, and the ones that actually worked on the streets. He said we were at war, and that meant sometimes doing things that wouldn't look good on paper." The defense attempted to portray Wilson as a dedicated officer working in difficult conditions, making split-second decisions in high-pressure situations. But each argument crumbled under the weight of evidence Bennett's investigation had meticulously assembled. Media coverage was relentless. National news programs ran special segments on policing the police. Documentarians interviewed Wilson's former arrestees. Social media filled with body camera clips that Bennett's team had made public during the investigation. What had begun as a trial of one officer evolved into an examination of an entire system. The jury deliberated for just 7 hours before returning their verdict, guilty on all counts. Judge Mercer's sentencing statement resonated through the hushed courtroom. Mr. Wilson, your actions represent not just crimes against individual citizens, but a fundamental betrayal of the oath you swore to uphold. The sentence of this court is 5 years in state prison, to be served without possibility of early parole. As the bailiffs approached to take him into custody, Wilson looked back one final time. Captain Bennett sat in the gallery, her expression not triumphant, but resolute, the face of someone who had completed a difficult but necessary task. Prison reality. Illinois State Correctional Facility processed inmate number 4729, one formerly Officer James Wilson, with the same efficient indifference shown to every new arrival. Fingerprinted, photographs, stripped, searched, dressed in standard-issue clothing, assigned a cell the procedures designed. To strip away individuality worked with particular effectiveness on a man whose identity had been so thoroughly tied to a uniform he no longer had the right to wear. The irony was not lost on Wilson that many of the men he now lived among had been arrested by officers using the very tactics he had pioneered. Some recognized him immediately. Others learned quickly enough who the new arrival had been in his previous life. "Look who's here," a voice called out during his first day in the common area. "Officer Wilson. Except you ain't an officer no more, are you?" Wilson had prepared himself for violence, had steeled himself for confrontations with men he'd put behind these same walls. What he hadn't anticipated was something far more destabilizing, being ignored. The majority of inmates treated him not with the fear he had once inspired or even the hatred he might have expected, but with a dismissive indifference that reflected his new reality. He wasn't important anymore. He held no power here. For the first few weeks, Wilson maintained the rigid posture and cold demeanor that had served him on the streets, walking the prison corridors with the same authoritative stride he'd used patrolling Westlake. But gradually, inevitably, the environment began to erode this facade. The turning point came during his 3rd month when he found himself face to face with Marcus Jennings, a young man Wilson had arrested 5 years earlier on drug charges that had resulted in a 10-year sentence. "You don't remember me, do you?" Jennings asked, cornering Wilson in the laundry room. "I was 22. Honor student. Working 2 jobs. You found weed in my car that I know wasn't there when you pulled me over." Wilson started to respond with the automatic denial he'd used so many times before, but the words died in his throat. What was the point now? Who was he protecting? "I remember," he admitted finally. Jennings studied his face for a long moment. "You know what's messed up? I've hated you for 5 years. Dreamed about what I'd do if I ever saw you again. And now here you are, and all I feel is nothing." He shook his head slowly. "You're just another guy in here now. Ain't that something?" That night, lying on the thin mattress of his cell, Wilson found himself doing something he had avoided his entire adult life, looking inward, examining the choices that had led him to this place. Not with excuses or justifications, but with the beginning of genuine reflection. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't even remorse, not yet. But it was something he had never allowed himself before, a moment of honest reckoning with the man he had become. Olivia's continuing mission. While Wilson adapted to life behind bars, Captain Olivia Bennett continued the work his case had only begun. The successful prosecution became both symbol and tool in her broader mission to transform Westlake's approach to policing. The Wilson case wasn't an endpoint, she explained during a community forum 6 months after the trial. It was beginning the start of a necessary process to rebuild trust between our department and the communities we serve. Under Bennett's leadership, the Internal Affairs and Ethics Division expanded from a token office used primarily to clear officers of wrongdoing into a robust, independent oversight unit with genuine investigative authority. Civilian complaints, once filed away and forgotten, now triggered automatic reviews. Body cameras, previously subject to technical malfunctions during controversial incidents, operated under strict new protocols with serious consequences for tampering. Most significantly, Bennett implemented a comprehensive retraining program for every officer in the department, focused not just on tactics and procedures, but on implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and community-centered policing principles. Ryan Thomas, promoted to sergeant, became a key ally in these efforts. Having seen firsthand how policing could go wrong under Wilson's mentorship, he brought valuable perspective to training new recruits in a different approach. Officer Wilson taught me that policing was about control, Thomas told class of Academy graduates. Captain Bennett taught me it's about service. That difference changes everything about how we interact with the people we're sworn to protect. Not everyone embraced the changes. Old guard officers resisted what they saw as interference with proven methods. Some resigned rather than adapt. Others attempted to wait out what they assumed would be a temporary reform phase. But as months passed and Bennett's policies took root, the department's culture began a gradual but unmistakable transformation. Crime rates, contrary to dire predictions from reform opponents, didn't spike. Instead, they remained stable while citizen complaints dropped dramatically. Neighborhoods that had once viewed police with suspicion began cautious cooperation with officers who approached them differently than Wilson and his protégés had. For Bennett herself, the work represented something more complex than simple justice. During a rare private moment, speaking with Commissioner Hayes after a particularly challenging implementation meeting, she allowed herself a brief reflection on Wilson's case. "People ask if I feel satisfied now that he's in prison," she said, looking out over the city lights from the commissioner's office window. "They expect this to be about revenge for what happened in that courtroom." "Isn't it?" Hayes asked. "At least partly." Bennett considered the question carefully. "What happened to me that day was just a symptom of something much bigger. Wilson believed himself untouchable because for 15 years he was. The system protected him, encouraged him, rewarded him." She turned from the window. "This was never about punishing one man for assaulting me. It's about ensuring no officer ever feels entitled to treat any citizen that way again." Hayes nodded slowly. "And Wilson himself, do you think he's learned anything?" "I don't know," Bennett admitted, "but the department has. And that's what matters most." As night settled over Westlake, the city continued its life, citizens going about their business, officers patrolling streets, the complex machinery of urban existence humming along. But beneath the familiar rhythms, something fundamental had shifted. A system that had once bent to accommodate men like James Wilson now held them accountable instead. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't complete. But it was change real and lasting in a way that transcended any single case or career. And in the end, that was what justice truly required. Wilson's internal change. 3 years into his 5-year sentence, James Wilson sat alone in the prison library, surrounded by law books he'd once had others interpret for him. The man who had entered these walls angry, defiant, convinced of his victimhood, was disappearing bit by bit, replaced by someone more thoughtful, more honest with himself. It hadn't happened overnight. For the first year, Wilson had clung to his anger like a life raft, blaming Bennett, Thomas, the system, anyone but himself for his downfall. But isolation has a way of stripping away pretenses. Without his badge, without his uniform, without the constant reinforcement of power, Wilson had been forced to confront the one person he'd spent a lifetime avoiding: himself. "You know what's the worst part?" he told his cellmate, Rodriguez, a former accountant serving time for fraud. "It's not the concrete walls, or the terrible food, or even the time I've lost. It's looking back and realizing I actually believed I was one of the good guys." That realization had come gradually, painfully, through long nights staring at the ceiling, through conversations with men whose lives he'd affected, through letters from Thomas that had started arriving unexpectedly in his second year, not seeking forgiveness, but offering context about the changes in Westlake since his departure. Wilson had begun to understand that the badge hadn't corrupted him. It had simply given him license to express something that was already there, a belief that some lives mattered more than others, that rules were for people without the power to break them, that fear was an acceptable substitute for respect. "I don't know who I am without the uniform," he admitted during a group therapy session he'd initially joined only to reduce his sentence. For 15 years, being Officer Wilson was everything. Being inmate Wilson, it's like starting from zero. This new identity, stripped of authority, of power, of the ability to intimidate, forced him to develop different ways of navigating the world. He'd begun, awkwardly at first, to listen more than he spoke, to consider perspectives he'd once dismissed without thought, to recognize the humanity in men he would have once seen only as perps. Was this redemption? Wilson wasn't sure such a thing was possible, or even deserved. The damage he'd done couldn't be undone with realizations or apologies or change behavior. Marcus Jennings still had 5 more years on a sentence based on planted evidence. Dozens of others had lost jobs, homes, years of their lives because of Wilson's actions. "Maybe the best I could hope for," he wrote in a journal he'd started keeping, "isn't forgiveness, but usefulness. Using what I've learned to prevent others from becoming what I was." The question of his future remained open, uncertain. But for perhaps the first time in his adult life, James Wilson was facing that uncertainty with honest self-reflection instead of the false certainty of power. Broader implications. Beyond the personal journey of one disgraced officer, the Wilson case had sparked conversations across America about what justice truly means in a system designed to protect its own. Documentaries, podcasts, law review articles, and community forums all examined the broader implications of a case that had exposed not just one man's misconduct, but an entire infrastructure that had enabled it. The true significance of the Bennett-Wilson case isn't about individuals, explained Professor Mariana Diaz during a nationally televised panel discussion. It's about recognizing that true justice requires systems that hold everyone accountable, especially those entrusted with power over others. In police academies nationwide, the case became a teaching tool, an example of how authority, when unchecked, corrupts not just those who wield it, but the institutions that fail to control it. Recruits studied the mechanisms that had protected Wilson for 15 years, learning to recognize and resist the gradual ethical compromises that had led to his downfall. For communities that had long suffered under aggressive policing tactics, Bennett's reforms in Westlake offered a blueprint for change, demonstrating that effective law enforcement didn't require sacrificing accountability or respect for civil rights. Several cities sent delegations to study the Westlake model, adapting its principles to their own departments. Perhaps most significantly, the case challenged fundamental assumptions about power itself, who should hold it, how it should be constrained, and what happens when it operates without meaningful oversight. The images of Wilson assaulting Bennett in that courtroom had become symbolic shorthand for a larger truth, that unchecked authority inevitably leads to abuse, regardless of who exercises it. The lesson isn't that all police officers are like Wilson, Captain Bennett told a graduating class of new officers. The lesson is that any of us could become like Wilson if we forget that our authority comes with responsibility, our power with accountability, and our badge with an obligation to justice rather than self-interest. In this broader context, Wilson's personal journey from arrogance to self-awareness reflected a larger societal shift, a growing recognition that systems must change to prevent future abuses, rather than simply punishing individual offenders after the damage is done. Final thoughts and viewer engagement. As we conclude this story, we're left with profound questions about the nature of justice itself. Was Wilson's downfall simply karma, a satisfying reversal of fortune for a man who had abused his power? Or was it something more significant, a necessary correction in a system that had strayed from its purpose? The line between justice and revenge can sometimes blur. When Captain Bennett pursued Wilson's case, was she seeking personal retribution for his assault or fighting for a principle larger than herself? Can justice for individuals also serve justice for communities? These aren't simple questions, and they don't have simple answers. What makes this story so compelling isn't just the dramatic confrontation in that courtroom, but the ripple effects that continue long after Wilson began serving his sentence. Every system in our society distributes power unequally. Whether in law enforcement, business, government, or even families, some individuals inevitably hold authority over others. The Wilson case asks us to consider not whether power should exist, it always will, but how it should be constrained, monitored, and balanced against fundamental human rights and dignity. We want to hear your thoughts on these complex issues. Have you witnessed or experienced abuses of power in your own community? Do you believe Wilson's punishment fit his crimes? Is systemic change possible? Or will there always be those who find ways to exploit their authority? Share your perspective in the comments below. Next week, we'll bring you another powerful story that examines these themes from a different angle. We'll take you inside the corporate world, where a high-powered executive's systematic harassment of employees leads to an unexpected reckoning when she discovers the person she's been tormenting has quietly become her new CEO. If you found value in today's story, please consider subscribing to Truth Revealed and sharing this video with others who might appreciate these explorations of justice, power, and accountability. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important narratives to light. Remember, the systems that govern our lives are only as good as our willingness to examine, question, and improve them. Together, we can demand more from those in power and from ourselves. New story teaser. The corner office on the 43rd floor of Barrett Industries offered a breathtaking view of the Chicago skyline, a fitting backdrop for a woman who had climbed to the top through sheer force of will, and, some would say, at the expense of everyone in her path. Victoria Barrett, Chief Marketing Officer and heir apparent to the company her grandfather had founded, ruled her department with calculated precision. At 42, she had the polished appearance of corporate success designer suits, perfect blonde bob, and the cool, appraising smile of someone perpetually evaluating others' usefulness. "Absolutely unacceptable," she said, dropping a report onto her glass desk with theatrical disappointment. Across from her sat Michael Chun, a talented young analyst who had made the fatal mistake of challenging one of her decisions during a team meeting. "This analysis lacks basic competence, Michael. I'm beginning to wonder if diversity hiring has lowered our standards." Chun flinched visibly at the thinly veiled racist comment, just one in a pattern of microaggressions, public humiliations, and impossible demands that had driven 5 team members to resign in the past year alone. Victoria's tactics were legendary throughout the company: isolate, undermine, and eventually force out anyone who threatened her authority or failed to show proper deference. "I'll revise it immediately," Chun said quietly, gathering the report with trembling hands. "See that you do," Victoria replied, already turning to her email. "And Michael, next time you contradict me in front of board, make very sure you're right. Your position here isn't as secure as you might think." This was Victoria's World 1, where power was a weapon to be wielded rather than a responsibility to be honored. For years, her talent and family connections had insulated her from consequences. Complaints to HR mysteriously disappeared. Executives looked the other way. The Barrett name, after all, was on the building. But unknown to Victoria, the company's leadership was changing. A massive restructuring was underway, orchestrated by a mysterious new investor who had been buying shares quietly for years. Tomorrow morning, a new CEO would be announced, someone with intimate knowledge of Victoria's management style and very different ideas about corporate culture. As Michael left her office, closing the door softly behind him, he allowed himself a small smile. In 24 hours, everything Victoria Barrett thought she knew about power was about to change forever. What happens when the tables turn? When the person you've tormented suddenly holds your fate in their hands? How does accountability function in corporate America, where power imbalances often remain hidden behind closed doors and carefully crafted public images? Join us next week as we explore another story of justice delayed, but not denied, a tale that asks whether redemption is possible for those who abuse their power, and what true accountability looks like in environments where there are no body cameras, no courtrooms, and no clear system of checks and balances. Final call to action. Here at Truth Revealed, we believe that examining power dynamics, whether in police precincts, corporate boardrooms, or any other institution, is essential to creating a more just society. Our stories may begin with individual conflicts, but they always connect to larger questions about how we structure our communities and what values we prioritize. The overwhelming response to our coverage of the Wilson Bennett case has shown us that these issues resonate deeply with many of you. You've shared your own experiences with power imbalances, debated the nature of true accountability, and engaged thoughtfully with complex questions that have no easy answers. This is exactly the kind of community we're working to build, one that values nuanced discussion over simplistic judgments, that recognizes justice as an ongoing process rather than a single verdict, and that understands how individual stories connect to systemic issues. If you haven't already joined this community, we invite you to subscribe to our channel now. Each week, we bring you carefully researched, thoughtfully presented stories that examine different facets of power, justice, and accountability in American society. Your subscription helps us continue this important work. We also encourage you to share these videos with friends, family members, and colleagues who might appreciate these explorations. Sometimes the most important conversations begin with a shared story that helps us see familiar issues from new perspectives. In the coming months, we'll be expanding our coverage to include international cases, historical parallels, and interviews with experts working to create more equitable systems of accountability. We'll also be launching a companion podcast where we'll dive even deeper into the issues our videos introduce. Thank you for being part of this journey. By examining these stories together, questioning, reflecting, and engaging with difficult truths, we take small but significant steps toward the more just world we all deserve.